Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the IHC Director, and I want to thank you all for coming to today's talk, which is part of our 2024-25 Public Event Series, Key Passages. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like also to pay respect to elders, both past and present. I am very excited to welcome Stephanie McCarter to speak today. Professor McCarter teaches classical languages and translation studies at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, where she has been on the faculty since 2008. She received her BA in Classics and English from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville and her MA and PhD in Classics from the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on translations of Greco-Roman literature, including Latin poetry of the late Republic and early Roman Empire. Her monograph, Horace Between Freedom and Slavery, the First Book of Epistles, appeared with the University of Wisconsin Press in 2015. She has also published verse translations of Horace's Epodes and Odes, as well as of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The latter, which appeared in 2022, received the Harold Morton Landon Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets and was included in the New Yorker's Best Books of 2022. The praise of and admiration for this translation cannot be overstated, and I'm going to cite only one of its many reviews written by Daniel Mendelsohn in the New Yorker, and it's so scintillating that you have to listen. It's a little longer than usual, but it's worth hearing. So he writes, McCarter confronts the tricky issues associated with both the poet and his epic, not only in her forthright introduction, but in the translation itself, where, like an art restorer moving decades of brown varnish from an old master, removing decades of brown varnish from an old master, she strips away a number of inaccuracies and embellishments that have accreted in translations over the decades and centuries, obscuring the sense of certain passages, particularly those portraying women and sexual violence. McCarter's translation reproduces Ovid's speed and clarity. Even better, she is alert to many of the sparkling verbal effects for which the poet was famous in his own time. If you didn't know she was writing about the concerns of someone who died 20 centuries ago, you'd think her subject was still alive. Oh God, can you imagine having someone write that about your translation? In 2024, she edited the volume Women in Power, Classical Myths and Stories from the Amazons to Cleopatra. The volume was recommended by Mary Beard as one of the BBC History Magazine's Books of the Year. Currently, she is working on a new translation of Catullus, and she has just been named a 2025 Guggenheim Fellow. So please join me in congratulating Stephanie McCarter and in welcoming her to speak today on translating Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to see so many people here, and it's wonderful, especially to be here at the invitation of an interdisciplinary humanities center. I work and teach and co-teach often in an interdisciplinary humanities program at the University of the South, so it's a project dear to my heart. So I do want to offer a content note that the talk today will contain descriptions of sexual violence. In my work, I aim to bridge classics and creative writing by producing translations of ancient literature that work as poetry, yet are also firmly anchored in my academic training and teaching. My talk today outlines my chief translation strategies with examples from Ovid's Metamorphoses, my translation of which was published by Penguin Classics in 2022. The first half of my talk focuses on my poetic tactics for transforming Ovid's verbal and metrical effects into English verse. Capturing these effects is crucial for communicating not only Ovid's famous wit and wordplay, but also his meticulous poetic architecture, through which he forges key connections across the vast labyrinth of his epic. In the second half, I will outline my strategies for interpreting and rendering Ovid's themes of sexual violence, gender, sexuality, and embodiment, some of which have made Ovid's epic controversial in recent years, but also, in the wake of the Me Too movement, made it continue to feel timely and urgent. These stylistic and interpretive strategies serve my larger goal of creating accessible yet poetic renderings that appeal to contemporary Anglophone readers and that let them see how ancient cultural ideas resonate with, yet are clearly distinct from, our own. Above all, I aim to offer translations that allow readers to delight in Ovid's rhetorical savvy, as well as wrestle with the difficult topics he perennially asks us to contemplate. I begin with meter. Formal meter lets me create poetic effects that mirror those of the Latin original while drawing on the English poetic tradition. There's indeed been a veritable revival of form in recent years among classical translators such as Aaron Puchigian, A.M. Juster, Diane Arnson-Svarlian, A.E. Stallings, Emily Wilson, Sarah Rudin, and others, and I'm excited to be a part of that. Since dactylic hexameter is not a meter that comes naturally to English, I used iambic pentameter, the meter that most immediately feels like poetry, especially epic poetry, to Anglophone readers. Meter became, to use a term introduced to me by Sherry Magid, my friend who's a playwright, an enabling constraint. It bound me into a fixed form, but by doing so, it fueled my creativity, freeing me from the overly literal and verbose translation many classicists, including me, have been trained to do. Just as dactylic hexameter, and dactylic hexameter is the meter of all ancient epic, and that's what defines an epic, is that it's written in this particular meter. So just as dactylic hexameter gave Ovid flexibility to create poetic effects with strings of quick dactyls, dum-diddy-dump-diddy-dump-diddy, or slow spondies, dum-dum-dum-dum, the variations possible with an iambic pentameter allowed me to replicate these effects where possible. Iambic pentameter, of course, consists of 5 iambs. Do not go gentle into that good night. Substitutions of trochees, stressed, unstressed, for iambs are occasionally allowed, especially in the first or fourth foot and after caesuras. Wordsworth, for instance, employs first and fourth foot trochaic substitutions in a line from the Prelude, over the sandy fields, leaping through groves. This produces speed and energy like Latin dactyls. One might substitute instead with slow, ponderous strings of spondies, as in Lady Macbeth's famous line, "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold." Feminine endings create further variety with an extra unstressed syllable, as in Elizabeth Bishop's "One art. The art of losing isn't hard to master." One can and should exploit these variations to good effect. To illustrate this, I offer a passage from Juno's descent into the underworld in Book 4 of the Metamorphoses, where Ovid describes the punishments suffered by famous sinners, including Sisyphus, Ixion, and the Danaids. I'll just read my translation. "You, Sisyphus, retrieve or push the rock doomed to roll backward. Ixion is spun, chasing and fleeing from himself. The Danaids, who dared to kill their cousins, fetch water that will ever drain away." Oh, sorry, hit the wrong thing. In line 460, Ovid's alternating dactyls and spondies, aut petis aut orgeis reditorum Sisyphe saxum, suggests the alternation of Sisyphus's spondaic pushing and the rock's dactylic rolling. Sisyphus, of course, is the sinner who's perpetually condemned to pushing a rock up a hill, which will then roll down. So you have the slow spondies of pushing and then the dactyls rolling. So I imitated this with the rock doomed to roll backward, Ixion, where the metrical inversion, doomed to roll back, is meant to imitate the swift rolling, while the 3 stresses in a roll, backward, ix, resume his slow pushing. Similarly, in the following line, the inversion in chasing and fleeing evokes Ixion's spinning, which Ovid achieves through dactyls, se sequitur quae fugit. Unrelatedly to meter, I also echoed Ovid's alliteration of P in the lines describing the Danaids, patruelibus repetunt perdant, by alliterating with D, Danaids dared drain. Elsewhere, in Book 3, the sailor Epodes tells how his crew was trapped at sea, then transformed into dolphins by the god Bacchus. I'll just again read my translation. "I swear upon the god himself, no god is closer now than he. that what I say is just as true as it seems false. The ship stopped on the sea as if it were dry docked. Stunned, they persist, striking the oars, unfurling the sails, trying to go with twice the effort. In lines 661 to 2, Ovid uses lots and lots of spondees. So, haud aliter quam si com na wale teneret, il ad miron tes re morin verbera perstant. Commentator William Anderson suggests this reflects the crew's struggle, but I read it instead as mimicking the unexpected fixedness of the ship. Bacchus makes the ship stop, and then he transforms the men into dolphins. In 663, Ovid switches to dactyls that evoke the crew's frantic rowing. So, vel liquidedu kunt gemina quape correre temptant. I imitated this by beginning my translation of line 661 with the emphatic inversion stopped, which, with the line end above, forms the slow ship stopped. I coupled this with the spondaic dry docked at the line end, then introduced numerous trochaic inversions to depict the crew's frenzy. Stunned, they persist, striking the oars, trying to go. The feminine ending in line 662 produces a similar effect, unfurling the sails. Such rhythms make meter an intrinsic part of the poetic experience, as it was for Ovid's original audience. One of the great delights of translating Latin poetry is reproducing rhetorical effects, such as wordplay, repetition, and chiasm. A key example of chiasm comes earlier in the same episode with Epodes, when he tells how he recognized at once that the boy his crew had kidnapped was the god Bacchus in disguise. His language has a clear A-B-B-A structure, and I'll just read my translation. I do not know what god is in that body, but in that body there's a god. My God in that body God, echoes Ovid's numen in isto corpora, corpora numen in isto. The chiasm does more than simply create poetic pleasure. It also brilliantly illustrates the intertwining of divine and human form within the metamorphosed body of the boy. Ovid elsewhere similarly uses stylistic devices to forge and articulate relationships between key characters. In the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, for instance, Ovid introduces the husband and wife in a series of heavily patterned lines. And Deucalion and Pyrrha, by the way, are kind of like the Roman Noah and Mrs. Noah. They survive the flood, right, in Book 1 that Jupiter sends to wipe out humanity. So, Jove sees the pools engulfing all the world, and how from thousands just one man survives, and how from thousands just one woman too, both innocent, both worshippers of gods. I maintained Ovid's parallel language here, with Deucalion and Pyrrha each described with an entire line in blue that is almost identical to the other. Then, sharing a line, divided at the caesura, the midpoint, with the repetition of ambo, both, in yellow. Many other translators, however, lose this parallelism, as in the version by Alan Mandelbaum. Jove saw that just one man was left of those who had been myriads, that but one woman had escaped the waves, two beings who were pious, innocent. The parallel language is crucial to maintain since it shows the unity between Deucalion and Pyrrha, whose mutual love forms a powerful foil for the story of sexual violence that follows that of Apollo and Daphne. In the tale of Alcyone and Ceyx from Book 2, which is probably my favorite now, Ovid evokes similar unity through patterned language. As Ceyx embarks on a doomed sea voyage, Alcyone begs to join him, saying, "Together we will bear whatever happens while borne together through the open sea." Ovid's interlocking A-B language, pariter feremos, pariter feremor, illustrates the couple's togetherness whatever the circumstances. Alas, I could not keep this order in felicitous English, so I used chiasm instead. Together, bear, born together, maintaining the polyptyton of Ovid's feremos, feremor in my bear, born. Other translators miss this patterning. For instance, Rayburn writes, "We shall share the danger and brave the waves in each other's company." A similar effect comes in the transformation of Bacchus and Philemon in Book 8, with the result that Ovid's Latin mimics not only the couple's shared affection, but also the intertwining of their boughs as they become trees. Baucis saw leaves sprouting on Philemon. Philemon saw leaves sprout on Baucis too. I managed to keep Ovid's chiasm, Philemona, Baucis, Baucida, Philemon, so ABBA, but had to place Baucis's name first, Baucis, Philemon, Philemon, Baucis. Ovid's interconnected language mirrors the lack of hierarchy or division that characterizes their humble home more generally. As he tells us at the story's start, it makes no difference if you ask for slaves or masters there. The house consists of two, and each alike gives orders and obeys. Ovid elsewhere strategically uses repetition to connect characters, even across different books, as with Procne, Book 6, and Hecuba, Book 13. Procne's husband Tereus brutally rapes her sister Philomela and cuts out her tongue, after which Philomela weaves a tapestry depicting the crime and sends it to Procne. After Procne reads the tapestry, Ovid describes her with the words poinai quinamogene totost, which I translate as consumed by thoughts of punishment. I keep this at 13:546, where Hecuba, distraught by the loss of all her children, is described by the same phrase. The repetition braids these women together as Ovid's foremost exemplars of women's grief-fueled rage, yet no other translator I have consulted maintains it. For instance, the most recent English translator, C. Luke Susi, renders the first line as, she hurled herself in dreams of her revenge, and the second, consumed by her vindictive fantasies. Another such repetition also involves wordplay. When Daedalus in Book 8 instructs his son Icarus about flight, Ovid pointedly alludes to an earlier Roman poet, Horace. I'll just read the English. Keep to the middle, Icarus. Follow my counsel. If you go too low, the sea mist will weigh down your wings. Too high, the heat will burn them up. Fly in between. I'll lead you. Seize the way. Ovid's Carpe Diem, seize the way, quotes Horace's Satires 2:693, spoken by the city mouse to the country mouse, which is probably a fable familiar to you. It comes from Horace. These words also echo the phrase carpe diem, seize the day, a phrase that Horace also coined and that is still famous, perhaps due mainly to the movie Dead Poets Society. The Horatian color of Daedalus's speech sits well within an exhortation to moderation, since Horace is the poet who also espouses the golden mean, aurea mediocritas, in Odes 2:10. Seize the way works nicely since seize the day has become the standard English rendering of carpe diem. Yet no other translator I have consulted picks this low-hanging fruit, neither here nor in Book 11, when the god Bacchus similarly instructs Midas to seize the way, carpe diem, to the river Sardis, where he can wash away his golden touch. Midas is anything but a figure of moderation, and like Icarus, his success or failure will depend on his ability to follow instructions. And he succeeds, whereas Icarus fails. Such wordplay was especially delightful to recreate and was essential in communicating Ovid's verbal wit. Another example comes from Book 14, where Ovid describes the transformation of the Cercopes, but does not say exactly what they turn into, giving instead, as Sarah Myers has pointed out, a punning hint, dissimiles homini passent similes quevideri, where Ovid's dissimiles, unlike, and similes, like, coupled by the word racemos in the following line, pun on the Latin word simia, ape, i.e. what they become. I translated this with whose looks aped humans yet did not ape humans. Again, other translators missed this pun entirely. A.D. Melville, for instance, writes that they seemed both like and unlike humans. Elsewhere in Book 13, Ulysses and Ajax battle with words to claim the armor of Achilles. At 13:268-9, Ulysses, otherwise known as Odysseus, says that what Ajax claims, refert, should not matter, refert. After a full day of hand-wringing that involved my annoying my husband to no end, I finally landed on the right translation, the only translation I could come up with, and you should discount his account of fighting Trojans and Jove to save the Argive fleet. I felt it was crucial to maintain some wordplay here, since it helps to develop Ulysses' characterization as a clever speaker, which is what ultimately wins him Achilles' armor. One untranslatable feature of Latin verse is the use of golden or silver lines containing nouns and adjectives in a chiastic ABBA or interlocking ABAB arrangement around a central verb. Latin poetry is famous for this. This is impossible to achieve in English word order, so I instead used patterned alliteration when possible. For the interlocking line, Malia purpura is frenabas ora capistris, at Met 10:125, I translate with sit on his back and use a scarlet bridle, with interlocking SB alliteration. I translate the similarly arranged line, et quae iactatis tetigis et sidera penis, using the patterned, though not interlocking, alliteration, the stars he'd soared to on his whirring wings. Because it was impossible to render all such lines with patterned alliteration, I peppered such lines throughout the translation when I could. So at the end of the Golden Age, justice was last of gods to leave the gore-soaked lands, LGL. Or Narcissus exclaims, possessing all I long for leaves me poor, PLLP. Marsyas transforms into streams that bustle to the sea in sloping banks, BSSB. As Theseus leaves Achelous' cave, daylight comes and morning sunlight strikes the mountaintops, MSSM. Later, Achelous hides his maimed horn by braiding reeds and willow round his brow, BRRB. This talk would go on for weeks if I cited each example of how I built Ovid's poetic effects into my own. Suffice it to say, there are countless instances of wordplay, repetition, line patterning, chiasm, alliteration, and on, and trying to recreate these was one of the great pleasures of translating this grand epic text. I would, however, like to mention one final poetic goal as a segue to the next part of my talk. I wanted the language of this translation to be as clear and direct as possible, at times even to feel quite blunt. This was a key stylistic choice. Had I been translating a different epic, I might have aimed for a more elevated or archaic style. Or maybe not. I don't really like archaic-sounding modern poetry. Compared to, say, Virgil or Lucretius or Statius, Ovid does not suit a heightened register. He is one of the most accessible Latin poets, and should be equally so in English. For some, such plain accessibility does not poetry make. Indeed, the word poetic in English is used often as a synonym for ornate or flowery, none of which I wanted my translation to be. My use of transparent, even blunt language intersects with my aim not to water down the violence, pain, trauma, and abuse of power that weave many of these tales together. Particularly when translating Ovid's scenes of rape, I wanted my language to be as unambiguous as Ovid's own. As someone who has taught Ovid numerous times in courses on women, gender, and sexuality in antiquity, I was attuned to these dynamics within the text to a degree that someone without that training would likely not be. Indeed, too often translators project later cultural assumptions onto the past, particularly when it comes to reticence about rape, constructions of the body, and attitudes about gender and sexuality. Often these projections result when one introduces ornate poetic language, ravish for rape, tresses for hair, bosom for chest, or when one inserts florid descriptors where there are none. This desire for accuracy was not just scholarly nitpicking on my part. Rape and its concomitant violation of another person's body sits at the heart of what it means to lose one's autonomy. It itself enacts a metamorphosis. The pronounced presence of rape in the epic suggests that Ovid himself found such violence worthy of critical interrogation. To gloss over it or to euphemize it is indeed to ignore one of his chief themes. The centrality of this theme in the epic has been well recognized in scholarship since the late 1970s, when Leo Curran could still describe rape as the, quote, dirty little secret of Ovidian scholarship. The tide has turned dramatically, and now anyone seeking academic articles about sexual violence in Ovid will find a plethora of results, and this important work has shifted our understanding of the poem enormously and for the better. Translation, however, has been slower to change. In 1993, Zola Marie Packman wrote a landmark article criticizing the use of euphemism in the translation of Roman comedy, a genre similarly replete with sexual violence. Yet even into the 21st century, translators have continued to euphemize such scenes. Even when Ovid's translators have not shied away from the word rape, they often still resort to language that titillates, sexualizes, or objectifies. A translator's choices greatly impact how the text is understood in such scenes. If, for instance, a rendering seems to romanticize rape, it might be tempting to identify Ovid or the narrator as unambiguously sympathetic to perpetrators. A translation that accurately communicates the nuances of Ovid's narrative voice, however, opens up the possibility that the epic itself takes a critical stance toward the violence it contains. I therefore set clear strategies for myself, rules, if you will, to strip away some of the euphemisms and inaccuracies I saw repeatedly in the existing translations. And I'll say these were not rules I kind of set up for myself beforehand, but they came out of translating, just kind of how-to guide for myself as I ran into issues. So, translation strategies. Translate rape as rape, not introducing language that romanticizes, euphemizes, or titillates. Critically interrogate the language around agency and consent, not implying a character has given consent when that is not clear in the Latin. Take special care when translating the body, not introducing gendered, sexualized, or racialized language absent from the original. Avoid assuming a male heterosexual gaze is a default. Avoid misogynistic, sexist, or gendered language not explicit in the original. Avoid analyzing characters' motives through the lens of later stereotypes and biases. I saw that happen a lot. So these strategies are deeply informed by my intersecting experiences as a scholar and a feminist. As I have argued elsewhere and repeat here, feminist translation is a tool for accuracy. It helps one scrutinize one's biases while giving translators tools for interpreting the gender politics of the original. For the remainder of my talk, I will show these strategies at work in key episodes that center Ovidian themes of gender, sexual violence, objectification, and embodiment. So, let me start with one of the most harrowing rapes in the epic, that of Philomela by her brother-in-law Tereus, which I mentioned earlier. In this story, Ovid narrates the rape itself very quickly, lingering instead on the violent excision of the tongue that follows, which in many ways stands in for the rape. I translate with equal economy. I'm just going to look at the actual rape and not at the tongue. So he first confesses his unspeakable crime, then conquers her, a virgin all alone, through force. The word vis, which I translate as force, is the most crucial word for a translator to get right. This is perhaps the closest Latin can come to a one-word correspondence for the English rape, for which Latin doesn't really have a word. But the words by no means line up directly. Vis was a key legal charge under which rape could be prosecuted, though it did not deal exclusively with rape, though the Lex Julia Devi did include a charge specific to unlawful sex through force, per vim stuprum. Vis is also covered various acts of public and private violence, such as armed assault or rebellion, as in the case of Catiline, who attempted to overthrow the state. This is not the place to get bogged down in complex Roman rape laws, but it is worth pointing out that they often excluded what we would certainly today define as rape, such as assault of sex workers and non-citizens. The rape of enslaved persons was chargeable under the Lex Aquilia of 286 BCE, but that was a property law that looked out for the rights of the enslaver rather than the body of the enslaved. The use of the word vis, force or violence, suggests that what is at stake and how Romans conceived of rape was the bodily autonomy of a free individual, which could be compromised by arbitrary acts of violent force. So how should translators handle the word vis and its combination in this passage with superat, to conquer? Some unambiguously use the English word rape to translate this phrase. So Rayburn, for instance, has his virgin prize was alone and he brutally raped her. Vis here becomes brutally. though prize has no parallel in the Latin. Humphreys has, he raped her, a virgin all alone. Others, though, leave out vis altogether. Morton has Tereus overwhelm the virgin, and Lombardo has him overpower her. In both cases, vis superat, to conquer through force, gets condensed into one word that effectively buries the key word for rape. There are lots of ways you can overwhelm somebody. Other translators, however, offer renderings that are entirely unsatisfactory and euphemizing. Horace Gregory has Tereus mount Philomela, while Melville and Ambrose have him ravish her, although the latter does include by force. One of my goals I did say on the day one when I signed the contract was the word ravish would not appear in this translation. The word ravish, as the OED points out, is now a somewhat archaic word to designate rape, and it can even carry suggestions of ecstatic delight and sensuous pleasure. As such, it now suggests a risque kind of sex, nevertheless consented to by all parties. It is ubiquitous, for example, in the titles of romance novels. As a translation for rape, it is simply unsatisfactory. I would like to tell you that's the only such slide I'm going to show, but that would be a lie. Why did I translate with force rather than simply use the word rape, which itself implies force? I wanted to maintain Ovid's clear focus on rape as an abuse of power, and therefore always rendered vis with the language of force, although elsewhere I often couple this with the term rape in phrases such as rape forcibly or forced rape. Vis appears throughout the Metamorphoses, and it is not always sexual. To translate the word simply as rape obscures links to other acts of force. One interesting example comes from Book 7, where Ovid introduces a series of girls who succumb to illicit love. The first, Medea, here says, "Sed trahit invitam noa vis." Some strange new force draws me against my will. With vis, force, and invitam, against my will, Medea employs the same terminology used earlier by the rape victim Leucothoe, who tells how the son assaulted her. Ille vim tulit invitae. He forced himself on me against my will. Such echoes make us ponder how love exerts power on its victims in varied yet entangled ways. Another key word for sexual violence is the verb rapere, which literally means to seize, and is the word from which the English term rape derives. Raptus, or seizure, kidnapping, was not yet a legal charge for rape in Ovid's Rome, yet he repeatedly uses this word to indicate non-consensual sexual acts. One example of this comes in the story of Io, a virginal nymph, again, whom Jupiter rapes in Book 1. I do translate here with the word rape to make clear the violence of this assault. So, don't run from me. She ran. She had already left Lerna's pastures and Lycaeum's orchards. When the god hid the stretching lands with fog, then checked her flight and raped her, chased no more. Rapuit pudorem, right there, is a tricky phrase to translate. One could render it very literally, like Lombardo, with he stole her chastity. It's literally what it means. But that waters down a phrase in a way that sounds to me old-fashioned and euphemizing. I'm reminded, once more, of the titles of romance novels. Don't look at my Google image search. It's just, because this is how, when I want to test how anything sounds in English, I always do a Google image search. So, okay. The phrase demands a stronger, more unambiguous translation. After all, a woman's chastity was her chief social capital in the Roman world, and violently stealing it through rape was an act that would cut off the victim's potential to marry or have legitimate children, as female citizens were expected to do. The violence of this act of raptus is clear if we compare these words to those used by Procne in response to Tereus's rape of Philomela, when she expresses her desire to castrate Tereus in a retaliatory act of raptus. I'll cut, literally, I will rapiam, or I will rapere, I will seize, snatch out his tongue and eyes, and that organ that raped you, literally stole your chastity. Using another word that means to still, obstulerunt. There's nothing euphemizing in Procne's words. Some other translators likewise use the word rape in the story of Io. Rayburn and Allison, for instance, both say he raped her, while Mandelbaum offers a translation that comes closest to my own. He raped chaste Io, retaining the important word pudor. Others, however, use obscuring language. Ambrose, for instance, has stole her shame. Though pudor can mean a sense of shame, to the modern ear, shame does not necessarily suggest virginity. It is not clear in Ambrose's rendering what exactly Jupiter stole. Morton combines rapuit pudorum into the single word dishonor, yet there are many ways to dishonor someone that do not involve sexual violence. Melville speaks not of rape, but yet again of euphemistic ravishment, offering up an encounter charged with eroticism more than brute violence. Gregory rewrites this line so as to suggest not rape at all, but seduction. To him, the theft of Io's pudor amounts to an overcoming of her scruples. In other words, he won her over by stealing away her sense of shame, i.e., her unwillingness to have sex with him. The verb rapere reappears again and again in the epic in scenes involving rape. In Book 6, for instance, the wind god, Boreas, he's the god of the northern wind, is designated a raptor, a thief, or as I translate, a rapist, when he kidnaps the princess Orithyia. This story, moreover, draws a direct parallel between raptus and vis. He delivers a kind of soliloquy. When Sweet Hawk failed, he bristled up with wrath, his normal mode as suits that wind, and said, "And rightly so. Why did I cede my weapons, my rage and force and wrath and threatening strength? Why pray when prayers aren't in my character? Force suits me. I chase off dark clouds with force. With force I shake the straits, topple gnarled oaks, pack down the snow, and strike the lands with hail." So strong is the connection between the verb rapere and rape that elsewhere, when Ovid uses the word in scenes that do not directly involve sexual violence, it still throws consent into doubt, as at 4:757-8, when Perseus snatches up Andromeda, whom he has just rescued in exchange for her hand. The verb makes us wonder if she really wants to marry him. Translating the word in such moments is especially tricky, though. But I've tried to use the English word snatch as often as possible in order to weave such scenes together. You can't consistently translate it as rape when it doesn't literally mean that, but does suggest non-consent. Many of the threads I have been tracing come together in Book 11's story of Caeneus. This tale combines several of my translation goals, including the clear translation of rape, the careful translation of the body, and the avoidance of misogynistic language with no parallel in the original, with which I would also include language that is transphobic or homophobic. Caeneus' story is narrated by Nestor to Achilles and several other warriors during a truce in the Trojan War. The topic of the hero's conversation is virtus, virtue, but literally that means manliness. The Latin word for man is vir, so virtus is the state of being a man. I translate throughout as manly valor. In this tale, Ovid transforms epic virtus from valor on the battlefield into an indiscriminate drive to penetrate others without being penetrated oneself, whether by sword or by phallus. It was such impenetrability that marked the body of the ideal Roman man, vir. Nestor cites Caeneus as an exemplar of this trait, which is noteworthy because Caeneus was assigned female at birth and named Caenis. He did not, however, conform to cultural expectations of women, such as marriage and procreation. So while Caeneus' body may have been female, he was never feminine. Yet he eventually suffers what many others who possess a female body suffer in the epic rape, in this instance by Neptune, who then seeks to make amends by granting Caeneus' wish that he no longer have a female form. Caeneus' rape, however, has, like Philomela's and Io's, been euphemized in several previous editions. My translation, which follows Ovid in using feminine pronouns and the name Caenis prior to the transformation, reads, "While strolling on the lonely shore, she suffered the forced rape," same language there, vis, same word, "of the sea god," that's the rumor. "Once Neptune stole the joys of novel sex, he said, 'Whatever you desire, you'll have it. Now make a wish.' Again, this is the rumor. Caenis replies, 'Such an assault demands a major wish. Make it impossible for me to suffer such a thing again.'" The term posse est, translated here as to suffer, can also suggest the passive role in acts of sexual penetration. The phrase vim posse est, therefore, can be understood very literally as indicating that Cainus has been sexually penetrated through rape. The term vis is combined here with inuria, it's underlined, with inuria, another legal charge under which rape could be prosecuted as a form of personal injury. Ovid's language, in other words, is legal and thoroughly unambiguous. In Horace Gregory, however, the god of the sea mounted her before she caught her breath. He was well pleased and thought that she was too. Whereas Ovid's Latin focuses us on Cainus's experience of suffering rape, Gregory takes us only into the head of the rapist, what he thinks. And the language of mounting echoes his earlier translation of Philomela's rape by Tereus. Gregory's Cainus later replies, "Make your gift a large one, for I shall never take a man again." The word inuria has simply been stripped away, replaced by words that suggest that Cainus actively takes, not passively suffers. Other translators do a better job of conveying the rape, but still use vocabulary that euphemizes it. In Charles Morton, for instance, Neptune forced himself on her, which nicely uses the language of force, yet he also then reverts to familiar euphemizing language. He had taken his delight by ravishing the maiden, which sounds extremely dated in addition to being euphemizing. Similar, A.E. Watts has Cainus tell Neptune, "This my ravished state demands a weighty prayer." And A.D. Melville says that the sea god ravished her. This episode takes up not only the theme of rape, but also that of embodiment, and especially the unsteady relationship between gender identity and the body. After Cainus asks for the impossibility of being raped again, the sea god grants now Cainius, a masculine name, a male body that in addition is impenetrable. Cainius thereupon becomes a consummate Greek warrior, participating in such heroic feats as the Caledonian boar hunt and the Centauromachy. Since Cainius' transformation is very focused on his corporeal form, it is useful to maintain a distinction between the physical body and culturally constructed gender, though, as Judith Butler has shown, ideas about the biologically sexed body are likewise products of cultural construction. When Nestor introduces Cainius, he states, "But I once saw Thessalian Cainius bear 1,000 wounds with no harm to his body. Thessalian Cainius, who won fame through deeds and lived on Othrys, and what's more amazing, had been born female. Moved by this new wonder, I'll ask him to go on." The word femina here must surely have its sex-specific nuance, i.e. female, as, for example, at Plautus, Rudanes, at 104, are you male or female, mas ne on femina. Rarely do translators keep this nuance, however, preferring to say that Cainius was born a woman, which to me does indeed seem marvelous, since I think of a woman as a fully grown adult, not a newborn baby. Ovid's monstri novitate, which I have translated as new wonder, need not have a derogatory connotation. To be sure, a monstrum is something novel that defies expected categories, but it does not necessarily indicate something condemnable. It suggests novelty and the unexpected blurring of boundaries, not moral revulsion, as is clear elsewhere in the epics. Here are two examples from Book 2 where the word appears. Cycnus turns into a swan, and it's described as a monstrum, a wonder. And a young woman is changed into a horse, and that's described as a marvel, a monstra. Cainius defies categories by performing masculine acts, winning fame through deeds, despite having been born with female flesh. Cainius need not, however, be thought of as Melville translates these words as a freak of nature, words that have a clearly negative connotation. In the epic, such novelty is not unusual. This is how nature operates. After all, Pythagoras in Book 15 describes nature as a re rum novatrix, an innovator of things. Cainius may be a marvel, but in Ovid's world, he is not unnatural, and he is one of several characters whose bodies take on different sex characteristics, including Tiresias, Iphis, Sithon, and Hermaphroditus. The word femina also appears after the rape, when Cainius says, "Da femina nasem," make me not female, as I translated. Here again, nearly all translators have Cainius request no longer to be a woman. Yet the focus on Cainius's body as distinct from his gender is again key. To him, a female body is one that can be penetrated and therefore enables rape. A male body, however, will not necessarily prevent such abuse, since male bodies, as Neptune well knows, are also subject to rape. And we have the rape of men at several points in Ovid's Metamorphoses. The only way Neptune can undo Cainius's penetrable femaleness, as Deborah Freyas has observed, is by giving him a kind of ultra-male body that resists penetrability of every sort. Using the term female over woman helps keep our focus on Cainius's shifting corporeality rather than his gender identity, which to my mind does not seem to shift. Cainius indeed is happy, Laitos, in his new form, which lets him transition to a way of life completely coded as masculine, indeed hypermasculine. In the words of Helen Morales, who is actually in the room, Cainius, quote, Cainius transitioned because he always knew that he was a man, and Neptune's wish gave him the opportunity to fully live as one, end quote. When we next meet Cainius, he has just killed 5 centaurs in the Centauromachy. These half-men, half-horse fighters see Cainius's battle prowess as a direct threat to their own masculinity, as if masculinity were a zero-sum game, which is almost always treated as being in the ancient world. Again and again, the centaurs try to re-feminize Cainius's body through penetration in order to bolster their own manliness. The centaur Halesus even uses a strategy used to attack trans people today, that of dead naming, the practice of purposefully using the name someone was given at birth rather than their chosen name. Halesus shouts, "Cainus, must I put up with you? To me you always will be female, always Cainus." Using Cainius's dead name suffices to communicate his hostility, yet from time to time translators slip in additional pejorative, misogynistic language not present in the Latin. For instance, Rayburn, despite his sensitivity to the language of sex versus gender here, has Halesus call Cainius a bitch. Similarly, A.D. Melville, whose translation has a decidedly Victorian flavor despite being published in 1986, has Halesus, one of my favorite quotes about this translation, and I'm not trying to be, as my grandmother would say, be ugly, is the best Victorian translation published in the 80s, which is great. It was on purpose, at any rate. He has Halesus refer to him as a wench, hardly a neutral word in any era. The addition of such language is distracting, giving Halesus' speech the quality of a sexist tirade rather than a provocation to the best warrior on the battlefield. His point is not that Cainius remains female despite his transition. Rather, it is that he, Halesus, is the only centaur man enough to penetrate this impenetrable ultraman, to make him female flesh once more. The body and its relationship to identity is also central to the story of Pygmalion and his ivory statue. Yet rather than exploring this complex connection, translators further objectify the statue and compel readers to view it only through a sexualizing male gaze. In this story, the sculptor Pygmalion is so disgusted by real women, what he perceives to be their faulty bodies and minds, that he makes a perfect statue. He makes a perfect woman, a statue devoid of human flesh or human identity. Pygmalion quickly begins to lust for the statue, but its hard body is sexually impenetrable, which can only be resolved through transformation. The story, in many ways, reverses that of Cainius. The statue's impenetrability makes it ultra-male, and it's only the intervention of a god, this time Venus, that can make it penetrable female flesh. Unlike in the story of Cainius, however, we never get to hear the statue speak, since the story ends abruptly as it comes to life. If we are to get any sense of the statue's agency, we will have to rely on nonverbal clues, and it is on the body that we find them. Although this episode is quite short, Ovid still mentions the statue's body over a dozen times as Pygmalion fondles, adorns, and admires it. So this is when it's still a statue. He decks her limbs with clothes, puts gems upon her fingers and long pendants around her neck. Smooth beads hang from her ears, and ribbons drape her chest. Everything suits her, and nude she's no less beautiful to look at. Interesting, and I didn't even think about this at the time, I used she, her pronouns for the statue at this stage rather than it, because it is an object. But I'm not sure in retrospect that this was the right decision. I would love to know your thoughts. I confess I was probably influenced by Carol Ann Duffy's poem, Pygmalion's Bride, which suggests she was in there all along and only came to life to get him to leave her the hell alone. You should all read Carol Ann Duffy's The World's Wife. It's a great collection. The transformation of the statue into a real, living, speaking, and aging woman will indeed not make the misogynistic Pygmalion happy. Nevertheless, the body parts here are not particular to female bodies, although the ornamentation is largely feminine, but not exclusively so. The redumicula, ribbons, for instance, are defined by the Oxford Latin Dictionary as bands attached to the back of various types of usually women's headdress. They would have been draped down the front of the statue's shoulders. The modern descendant of these are the ribbons that appear on the back of the mitre hats worn in a number of religious denominations, and in the East were associated with Easterners. In Virgil's Aeneid, to give a parallel, a Latin warrior named Numanus accuses the invading male Trojans of effeminacy for wearing these, but he's also accusing them of being Eastern, right? So your tunics have long sleeves, your caps have ribbons. You are not Phrygian men, but Phrygian women. Yet to Ovid's translators, these ribbons become a sort of bra worn on the statue's highly sexualized breast, which is not what I think we're supposed to think of in this passage. Gregory renders these with added adjectives as golden chains encircling her small breasts, recalling to my mind a kind of chain bra contraption. To Rayburn, Pygmalion girdled the breasts with elegant bands. Alison has a corset affixed to her breast, and Morton a lacy brassiere. We've come a long way from a mitre hat. Lombardo hits upon the correct region, but uses a term that still denies her a simple chest. Long necklaces around its décolletage. A Google image search for décolletage shows its strong associations with feminine bodies. Translators' infatuation with the statue's breasts recurs again later as the statue becomes animated by Pygmalion's hands. He kisses her again, and with his hands he also feels her chest. The ivory grows soft, its hardness gone, and sinks beneath his fingers' touch. Where exactly do Pygmalion's hands touch the statue? Most likely, simply on her chest. I should add that it's not at all unusual for Latin to designate a singular body part with a plural noun, so pectora is actually plural, right? He touches her chests. But this happens a lot, as in Virgil's Aeneid, when the Trojan Cupencus offers up his chest, the plural pectora. You'll even learn it in Latin class as the plural of the body part affected, so this is what happens. Offers up his chest, pectora, to Turnus's sword. Several translators render the statue's pectora with the singular breast, leaving it a bit ambiguous. Lombardo, for example, has, he touched her breast with his hand. But others more specifically have Pygmalion fondle a breast or her breasts. In Mandelbaum, he reaches with his hands to touch her breasts, whereupon his fingers probe. In Rayburn, he started to stroke her breasts with his sensitive fingers. In Alison, he touched a breast. In Gregory's Pygmalion, touched her breasts and cupped them in his hands. And in Charles Morton, Pygmalion is exciting her breasts with both hands, which causes the statue to become aroused. Ovid does perhaps leave open the possibility that Pygmalion touches the statue's breasts, which are, after all, on her chest, but he leaves this to our imagination. What I find interesting is that faced with the choice, so many translators have opted for the more sexualized and objectifying reading. How much better it is, in fact, to think of Pygmalion as activating not the statue's breasts, but rather her chest, the part of her body that will become her sentient self, the part that the Romans thought of as the seat of one's emotions and identity. To quote Svetlana, I've practiced this name and I'm going to get it wrong, Svetlana Kachowska-Stefovich, terrible pronunciation, sorry. The pectus in Ovid is, quote, conceived as a container in which an infinite set of things can be stored. Senses, breathing channels and breath, voice and speaking abilities, emotions and feelings, memories, thoughts, and mind. as soon as her chest is activated, she's going to think, she's going to feel, she's going to speak, right? This detail brings readers into the agency of the statue as she comes to life, rather than making us see through Pygmalion's eyes as he gropes and gazes at her. The problems with these sexualizing translations go beyond simple inaccuracy and are tied to the presence of rape throughout the epic. The statue up to now has been an inanimate object, but in these lines, she is being born. In her first moments of awakened consciousness, the man who is both her creator, her father, and her future husband acts upon her sexually. And this is already true in Ovid's Latin. She has no ability to offer anything like consent to Pygmalion. We do not even hear her speak. It is irresponsible, to my mind, to choose the most provocative way to describe this moment of what can only be termed sexual assault. This episode follows the epic's larger pattern of gendered violence, wherein the spectacle of a woman in her most powerlessly vulnerable state sparks desire in the character viewing her. But Ovid's own point of view is often difficult to pin down. It is not always clear if his gaze is as ruthless as that of his characters, or if he is writing to titillate or to horrify. If translators tip the text too far in gleefully eroticizing such scenes, we risk losing sight of Ovid's ambiguities. One shortcoming of these translations is that they all assume and cater far too strongly to a male heterosexual reader. I hope that by avoiding assuming a cis hetero male gaze by default, I have opened up fresh ways into the text for new readers of all identities. By way of conclusion, I want to restate the translation goal I outlined at the beginning of this talk: to create modern, accessible, and poetic renderings that let readers see how ancient cultural ideas resonate with, yet are clearly distinct from, our own. By wedding form and content so closely in my mind, I hope I was able to capture at least some of Ovid's kaleidoscopic complexity, how his verbal wit and poetic play serve the larger themes of love and power, how his interest in the body makes us ask what it means for human identity to exist within a changeable form. This is true for us as it is for any character in the epic. How sex and gender and the body are persistent concerns across time, even as what we think about them does not ever long persist. Above all, I hope I have given us an Ovid that moves us forward, not backward, one that tries on every page to take into account how today's 21st century readers speak in the world, as well as how they think about the world. Perhaps the most abiding lesson Ovid offers us in the Metamorphoses is that for anything to survive across time or place or distance, transformations are critical. He knew his own Latin would be confined temporally and geographically, and perhaps culturally, to Rome itself. As he says in the epilogue, where Roman power spreads through conquered lands, I will be read on people's lips. For Ovid to outlive Rome and continue to be read on people's lips, he simply must be transformed and translated for new times and places and languages and cultures, with each iteration giving him replenished life. I hope the metamorphosis I have enacted on Ovid's text will help him realize the epic's powerful last word, "Wewam," I will live. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I really enjoy your talk. That was really amazing. You kind of talked briefly in the end about how these translations are critical in our modern day world. Also, in connection to a lot of the stuff you talked about, it's very timely with what's happening right now. And I just want to ask further why people should care about these new translations, and how does these translations spark a more complex conversation?
Oh, I just want to take the word conversation that you used. I think there are many reasons people should care about the new translations, but care about Ovid, and that's because it's part of a conversation that's been going on for so long, right? It's been going on for thousands of years. It's going to continue to go on. If we can still write articles about Ovid in the New Yorker in the year 2017, 2022, then he still resonates culturally, right? It's a text that is so changeable. And I think we should keep caring about translation because I think of it as, you have to retranslate these texts, right? Otherwise, texts themselves are fixed in a cultural time and moment, right? And so if they don't get, I have not translated Ovid in any definitive way at all. There are already people who've published translations or who are working on new translations of this text. But through translation, we can see how our own culture, from one translator to another, from one person to another, is wrangling with difficult ideas, right? You actually kind of see in time, over the course of, you can just look, read a translation from the early modern period, read 20th century, read a translation from the mid-20th century. You'll see our culture change, right? You'll see how we've used Ovid over time to kind of think with as a mirror for ourselves. And so I don't know, I feel like that is a kind of interesting exercise in and of itself. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful talk. I wanted to ask a little bit about using your translation for teaching and pedagogy. A lot of us here teach the big Greek mythology class here. And it's Greek mythology, but we also, do some Ovid, obviously. Right. It's constantly difficult when you have these very dated translations to teach, particularly things like sexual violence, to, an audience who doesn't know the original. Right. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how you see your translation fitting in to pedagogy around Ovid and mythology in general.
Well, I would like to think that it does a few things. It shows that when our students come into our class, I think that there's something in knowing that so many of the things that they think about, right, were the subjects of thinking over millennia, right? They know before they come into a class, mythology is going to think about the big questions, right? Well, those questions had to do with gender and the body and sexuality and violence, what it means to walk through the world in ways that feel very Ovidian, right? And so I think that it enables students to take part in this long conversation. But if you are using a euphemizing translation, it means that they don't develop the right language for discussing these big issues, right? And so I think on the one hand, it gives students vocabulary with which to talk about sexual violence, to talk about just the big questions in general, right? On the other hand, it lets them see that the way we think about things has changed over time. That Ovid does use a word that means physical violence, right, to describe rape. It lets them see that, for a long time, thinkers have recognized that rape is an abuse of power. This is not something that feminists suddenly invented in the 1970s, right? And the people have asked me too, why does Ovid care about that? He's not a feminist. Why are we? I'm thinking, well, because he's interested in freedom, right? He's interested in autonomy. These were big questions in the Roman world, and so it gives students a different angle, right, to look at it. So let's think of rape not as, a crime of passion or whatever, but a crime about freedom, right? So I think there's so many ways that you can use these texts in a classroom to get students thinking about really big, important questions at a bit of a remove, right, from the heated political, conversations that we're having, but think about them in terms of the big cosmic picture that Ovid unfolds for us. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant talk. I enjoyed it quite a lot. I'm still thinking about what you had to say about kindness, and gender, and especially transgender identity and so forth. Yes. So I was specifically curious, when you translate femina as female for kindness rather than woman, do you think that's rendering an Ovidian or Roman sentiment, or strictly a modern distinction between what is often called biological sex and gender identity?
That's a great question, and and I don't know if I have a great answer for that. Unfortunately, obviously this is an episode that I wrestled with a lot, because you want to be sure that the way I'm understanding the episode is is the way Ovid presented the episode, right? But I do think that if you look at the episode in terms of the larger epic and the focus in the epic on the body and transformation, right, that gave me, I think, the footing I needed to think about that the way that I did, right? And that throughout the epic, again, we have so many characters who are subjected to sexual violence, the vast majority of whom have female bodies, right? Now, on the flip side of that, we also have people with male characters who are subjected to the same violence. But I think that Ovid is really getting us to think a lot about, the body as a constantly vulnerable, penetrable entity, right? Even masculinity in the epic, right? Even a male body is penetrable, which is why Cainius has to become kind of ultra male, right? So, to me, so much of it was about the body. And when Romans, present the male body, right, the chief aspect of that is impenetrability. And if we're going to relate that to, like, freedom, right, at the heart of what Roman freedom meant, having the male body of the Roman man, it meant that your body itself would not be subjected to arbitrary violence. It was so centered upon the experience of the body. And so while I think they didn't think about gender in the same terms in its relation to the body that we think about it today, I think that they just thought about it in ways that resonate with the ways that we think about it today. But I'll be thinking about the Cainius episode for the rest of my life. So I haven't really got... It's a published translation. It's not a finished translation. So, yeah.
Hi, this is great. So I'm curious because your translation is published by like a major publishing house with like marketing teams and things like that. Right. And so something that I'm very curious about is who the imagined audience is, like both for you as like the person who's crafting this, but also like, for the industry. Yeah. And part of the reason why I'm thinking about this is like I love the romance novels, right? For the Ravish. Yeah. Partly because I'm thinking about Janice Radway's Reading the Romance as, where she's interviewing a community of like voracious romance readers in the 80s. And, she's observing like, okay, so there is this feminist movement that is like trying to articulate questions of sexual violence, and it's very concerned about rape in romance novels, right, where it is so like florid. And what she comes to through her interviews is like, well, for this community of women, this is giving them language and space to think about problems of power and violence in ways that they might not otherwise have opportunities to. Right. And so I'm kind of thinking about like how this question of audience like refracts like the language or the address that you use for these questions of power. Right. Like the slogan that I use in a bullhorn at a protest is going to be different from the one that I use like, domestically while my children are at school or what have you. So anyhow, I'm curious about this question of audience, and especially as it sort of passes through the industry machine. I can't really, what was interesting, and my publisher, shockingly, she never really addressed questions of audience with me. Her name is Elda Roeder. She's amazing in every way, and she was so supportive of my vision of the translation that I think she just trusted that there would be an audience for this. There has been an audience, but she didn't. She and I did not discuss it in that way. So I didn't really feel this sort of pressure in that way because this was from a major publisher. Like, I honestly have felt so much more pressure from academic publishers to think about this, like, honestly. But in terms of my own thinking about the audience, if I can address maybe that, like, who was my imagined reader? We don't know who Ovid's imagined readers were. We do know, however, that Ovid does imagine that women could be readers of his works repeatedly. The third book of the Ars Amatoria is addressed to women. Book 1 of the Ars Amatoria, he says, well, I know that women could read this, but I'm not writing for certain types of women. He writes a work on women's makeup. He's always very interested in women as readers. And even if you read through the Metamorphoses, you have a number of scenes where women are, like, the reading capacities and audiences are women, and audiences are women. Their reading capacities are emphasized. So Procne reads Philomela's Tapestry. In Book 5, you have the Muses
have a singing contest with the Pleiades, and nymphs are the judges, right? You have certain female characters who go to other female characters in the epic and present them with evidence about rape. They discuss rape. So I was thinking in a lot of ways that one of the main groups of readers I wanted to reach out to were women, and thinking about it in terms of Ovid's own themes of having a female audience and how women can interpret something. There's really this one interesting moment in Book 5 when Ceres, whose daughter Proserpina, has been kidnapped, and she is offered evidence for this rape by a nymph named Sewanee, who's a fountain nymph, and Sewanee gives her or shows her the kind of belt of her daughter. And there are all kinds of associations with that in the ancient world with the loss of virginity. So Ovid says he gives her signa so that she can understand what's happened to her daughter. She goes to Jupiter and she says, our daughter has been raped. I would like to get her back. Thank you very much. And he says, this is not inuria. He uses a rape term that we saw today. He says, this was love. Where rules on more? True love. And so you actually have in the epic itself ways that women read a rape scene versus how men read a rape scene, and the way that the women read it are different from the ways that the male characters read it. So I wanted to give weight to the way the women in the epic itself were reading and understanding these scenes. Yeah, thanks.
This is a complete non-expert question. I'm only here because I read a review of your book and I was fascinated by it.
Thank you.
So I read a lot of Russian and German literature and translation, and I always dutifully, Google what's the best translation, what best captures the original language. And, I compare them sometimes and they're not that different, at least the contemporary ones.
Right.
But your examples were like almost so different that the meanings were different.
Yeah.
So my question is it because you're translating from Latin? Is it because it's poetry? Or is it something unique to Ovid that makes the translations so different?
That's a great question. I will say that what makes, even the other translators, though, they're very different, right? I think that there has been, in translating classical poetry, there's never an official translation, right, of classical poetry. Like, Elena Ferrante has her official translation. Nobody else is going to translate those novels in any kind of official way. My colleague is Kevin Wilson, who is a novelist, and he kind of humorously told me a story one day that his German translator wrote him an email and said, what kind of mud are you talking about in this scene? I need to get it correct, right? And I can't resurrect Ovid. Nobody can resurrect Ovid and ask what he meant in a particular scene. And so that means that the classics have become a proving ground, in a way, for poets and translators to show their own poetic brilliance, right? And so I think some of this is this desire to move away from literalism, to embrace a creative approach to the text. And so much of that then is, finding your voice, finding your own poetic way to render these texts. I think that's one reason why they're so different. I think one reason mine is different is that I'm a classicist. First and foremost, I have always been a classicist. I became a translator by accident. And so when I started looking into translating and thinking about that, I thought always, what would I want my students to see here? And that was always grounded in the Latin. And so I started there. And so it wasn't a desire for literalism or being hyper-literal, because a lot of my translations aren't, but it was, what would I want my students to see? What do I think is the most necessary thing in the Ovid for the readers to be able to see? And then trying to build that in. So it's a couple ways to approach that.
Thank you again for this. So I want to bring us back to a moment you beautifully described of weaving different parts of this translation together. And
Yeah.
Ovid is huge, conceptually different than a lot of other epics because it's so many stories.
Yeah.
I wanted to get a sense of how you have been thinking about weaving these things together. What is your strategies for approaching a text like this? And I know some of these are ones you have talked about, but I want to hear more.
Okay, I could answer this question for the rest. Do we have our sleeping bags so we can stay here for the rest of the night? Because they're... Ovid describes the poem as a Carmen perpetuum, which is like it goes on and on and on, and it is never going to stop. It's also going to last forever. And so one of the main criticisms I've gotten of the translation, and I kind of share it, is that the way the stories are broken up kind of ruins that in a way, because it seems like almost completely, the text pauses. It doesn't. Every translator, almost, except for a few, they will use titles. But whoever designed my book, sorry, I'm glad that wasn't here. I need to gesture less. Whoever designed it did put these like really big at the top. So the weaving work wasn't done in the design, right? But so what I was trying to do in terms of like the weaving of myself, because Ovid does use a weaving metaphor. He tells the gods, he says, deducite, spin out. It's a weaving metaphor. If you think of the distaff and the thread coming down it, you're pulling down the thread and you're spinning it. That's what he asks the gods to do. And so presumably what he's going to do with that thread is weave a tapestry. And then we have lots of weaving that happens in the epic. We saw where Philomela weaves her tapestry. So part of that was thinking of the way he weaves his words together, right? So some of the stylistic choices I was making, meter becomes a way that I think of meter as stitching. My grandmother was a massive quilter. Like I have so many quilts she made, and sometimes I will look at the back of the quilts that she makes, and I will see all those stitches, and I think that's what I was doing. The kind of meticulousness of the stitch, right? They're just perfect little hand stitches. So the meter weaves it together, and then certain vocabulary will weave it together as well. So, I think of in book 3, the most important word in that book is imago. It means it means like image, but it can also mean echo, and it can also mean reflection, and that's very important when you have in that book the story of Echo and Narcissus, right? And so I always tried to translate that in the same way, right? Or I always tried to, translating rapio in a similar way as much as I could. So a lot of that was like the verbal repetition, patterns I was trying to bring out in the different stories. But yeah, I'll stop there because that could take me on and on and on.
Hi, first of all, I really like what you've done here. I really enjoyed your talk. I especially like what you've done with specific Latin words.
Oh, thank you.
And now I'm an undergraduate student, right?
Oh,
so I'm learning Latin for the first time.
Excellent.
So I wanted to ask you if you had, two things. If you had recommendations for like Latin learners as to when to learn the language in sort of a less antiquated way, because, it tends to be written in textbooks, it tends to be very antiquated. Like, when you mentioned the word rapere, I don't even know if our textbook had it as to rape. I think it was just to seize capture. And then secondly, how did you get to the point where you were able to retranslate these in a less antiquated way? I'm curious about your process.
Well, I will give you some advice about what I think of as what Latin students should be doing, and that's enjoy it and be creative with it. No Latin student has ever been told to be creative. Sorry. It doesn't happen. And you have to say, and even with my own Latin students, I'm translate it literally first. I'm with the town having been captured, all the citizens ran to the sea, right? And so, okay, that's step one. And there's always a step beyond that. So what do you do then, faced with that conundrum? So a lot of Latin teachers say, always get your students to resist the urge to translate. It's going to take away every bit of pleasure they could get in learning the language if they have to translate like that. They shouldn't be translating ever. They should just be reading the Latin, right? As though you could get to where somebody reading a modern French novel or something like that. I don't do that. I lean into translation, but I say do it creatively. So. We pull words apart. It's great for Latin students to wrestle with all the different possible English connotations of a word, right? It's so good. It gets them diving into their own language. It gets them thinking creatively about something. We do these little readings called 38 Latin Stories in my Latin class. I'm like, you know them, I can tell. And anyway, so I tell them, I get them okay, now do your creative translation, right? So I hope that you can play with translation. I think that in a time when Latin, the enrollments are going down, thinking about engaging with this in a really creative, fun way can can only help, right? So I'd say be fun, have fun with it. That's the best thing. You asked me how did I get to the point where I could do that. Meter. Meter is the only way I could do that. Because when I started translating, it was just, I had the bravery of a fool when I started translating. I was like, of course I can translate the entirety of the Odes of Horace, like this summer, I'll just do it. And that was folly, but it was that folly that made me do it, right? It was, anyway, and then I started translating, and it was bad. And a friend of mine, Stephanie Batke, who's a medievalist, she and I were talking in my office one day, she said, just translate it into meter. And I thought, you think that would do it? She said, well, just try. So I started translating into meter, and I went to her office. I was like banging on the door. I was like, this is great. I was like, now listen. And so I read her what I wrote, and she was like, yes, do it that way. And I've never stopped translating into meter. So, it means you can't say, with the city having been destroyed, right? You can't do it. You have to think of new ways to say it. And once I was able to remove myself from the straitjacket of literal, like highly literal translation, I could only do that by tying myself into another straitjacket of meter. But by doing that, it really freed me to be creative. Yeah.
Okay, I'm so sorry that I'm in the way of the reception, but it's more of a curiosity. Since, for my MA, I had to do a translation as well, and I was doing following the same rules that you were following, but I was translating to Portuguese, and Portuguese has this thing as, Latin that Latin has neuter, but in Portuguese, nothing is neuter, yeah. And then I had, all these problems of putting gender into things, Yeah. And I feel that English is such a good language for not doing this. Yeah. And I was curious to know if you checked translations in other languages than not English, and if that that changed something in your translation in some way, And just a small commentary. You were talking about the statue. And you're like, I don't know why I used she. And this is so real because in Portuguese, statue is she. I would say she. And then I was like, every time I would have to translate something and put she or he, I'll be like, oh my God, in English, this would work perfectly. But I'm not translating in English. So anyway, yeah.
That's great. I didn't. The only other translation, and not in English, I looked at was Marie Cosnay's French translation, which was not that long ago, and it's very good. But there were times when I longed for gender in English. I'll tell you one example. When Daphne turns into a tree, and she's been like that girl, that girl, that girl, and suddenly we're told that Apollo Honk Amat Quoque, I don't have the epic memorized by now, but Honk Amat Quoque, he loves this feminine thing too, right? Is that Daphne? Is it the tree? Ovid's language leaves it really ambiguous, but as a translator, you have to decide. So does he love it? Does he love the tree, right? Which is how I went with it. Or does he still love her? Does he love her this way too? And so that's what most other translators have done. And that's why I pushed against that for lots of reasons I'm not going to get into here. But it would have been great if I had some kind of gender marker in English to keep that ambiguity. But you're right. I'm glad that English isn't as heavily gendered in that way. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.